Hello, NG Houston. So we're back tonight with one more of Denny's Angular Upgrade series. What are we on, Denny? Episode 4 tonight, right?
That's right. It's part 4. It's the 4th broadcast.
And we have Sam Julian joining us from NG Portland. Hello, Sam.
Hi. Thanks for having me.
So we got some really cool stuff. So I'm just going to turn it over to you guys and let y'all rock and roll and teach us. So you're going to explain what. I'll let you do it. You're going to tell us what we're going to go over tonight, right?
Yeah, let's go ahead and get started. So Sam is going to help me present tonight. So I'm going to start off here, and then we'll switch over to Sam here a little bit later in the presentation. So tonight, as Bonnie said, we're in part 4. It's our 4th broadcast, but it's actually like our 5th session of 6, if you've been following along in our series. So tonight's episode or tonight's session is Angular alongside of AngularJS. And in our series, we started several weeks ago where we talked about the history and how last year at this time we were just learning about the new version of Angular that was coming. But this year we're trying to figure out how to get our production apps upgraded to that new platform. Then we talked about the AngularJS to Angular concepts. There were a lot of changes, so we put them kind of side by side and tried to dissect what those differences really were, what things were the same, what changed, and what were different. So if you want to see those topics, go to our first part. We've got that recorded on YouTube. And then we moved into the new development environment where we talked about the new tools and the understanding of the developer's environment that we need to have as we start to write Angular code. We know that we'll need to start using TypeScript, and there's a lot of benefits to that, in fact. And we also talked about the Angular CLI, which is the command line tool, which is, and actually let me share my slides here for you guys. So we talked about the Angular CLI, which is a command line tool that expedites our Angular development, makes it really easy to do things quickly as a developer when we're writing Angular. And then last week, we talked about the new ways that we need to think about how our applications are composed. There are 2 modern principles in front-end design that have proven to produce scalable, powerful code, and that's the component architecture and one-directional data flow. So we learned how to begin applying those techniques in our existing AngularJS code to prepare both the code and our mindset to start thinking in Angular. And that brings us to today, where we'll see how it's possible to actually run both AngularJS and Angular in the same application, despite their differences in setup and syntax. So today we're going to introduce something called ngUpgrade, and then I'm going to demonstrate how to install ngUpgrade into your project. Then Sam is going to help demonstrate the use of ngUpgrade as you start to transform your code. And we'll wrap up with some lessons learned. So recall from our first part, we talked about the different ways we could upgrade our AngularJS application. Our first option was to perform an entire rewrite from scratch. So that would essentially be spinning up a brand new Angular application project and using our original AngularJS application as almost a requirements or specification and just simply writing everything anew in Angular. Then our second option was to refactor our code towards Angular and then rewrite. So that would involve using some of the techniques we've discussed earlier in the series to transform the AngularJS code into a form where it uses some of the same concepts that are key to writing Angular apps. And then we would go ahead and rewrite from scratch. Our third option would be to refactor our existing project straight to Angular. And then the fourth option would be to refactor and rewrite our existing code in its AngularJS project into some Angular form and do that in steps. But how would we be able to do that? How could we effectively run both AngularJS code and Angular code in the same project? And the answer is the ngUpgrade library. That's what allows us to share both AngularJS and Angular code and run them simultaneously so we can actually develop. So the ngUpgrade library was produced by the Angular team itself. It contains the upgrade module that allows us to run these two simultaneously. And it supports that iterative AngularJS to Angular code upgrading process. So let me show you how to upgrade or how to install the ngUpgrade library into your projects. There's actually several steps and to this process. The first thing we'll need to do is prepare the AngularJS code before we can even install any Angular framework or its dependencies. And then we'll go ahead and install the ngUpgrade library, and we'll replace the bootstrapping that we use in an AngularJS app with Angular's bootstrapping. And from that point, we're ready to start using ngUpgrade. So just to show you what this is going to look like, we're starting with a very simple AngularJS 1.x code base or project. All it has is AngularJS. All of the scripts are included into the document via script tags. They're sequenced manually to make sure that dependencies are met. All of the source code is simply wrapped in an IFI, so it's kind of an old school way of writing. It's how we used to write our AngularJS applications. And then we're going to add in a module bundler, and I'm going to use require.js because I have some familiarity with that. When you look online, you'll probably see demonstrations and examples of system.js. But remember, the intent is the same. It's just adding a module loader to your program, or to your project, which will allow you to remove those script tags from your document. It allows you to defer some of the dependency management of loading your code into the project or into your running application. You can defer that responsibility to your module loader, whether require.js, Webpack, or system.js. So at this point, we're going to have require.js handling our AMD module loading, or really handling our module loading using the AMD pattern, which is asynchronous module definition, unlike universal module definition, UMD, which you may see in system.js. And then we're still going to have our AngularJS source code just like we had it in part one. It's just wrapped as IFIs, and we haven't changed or touched any of the code. We've just introduced require.js. And then we're going to add TypeScript, but really just TypeScript configuration into the project. So again, we've left our code alone, and we're going to add in just TypeScript configuration. And we're doing that because we know that once we start writing Angular, we're going to need to write our code in TypeScript. So we need to have that set up and staged so that we can even introduce things like the framework, as well as this ngUpgrade that we want to use. That's all in TypeScript, so we have to have that set up in our project. So at that point, we can add in Angular, and we'll be all set to introduce new code as TypeScript into the project without touching our original AngularJS code. So I'm going to pull up a project here and show you what we're going to be looking at here. So I've got a project here for an application. It is called Memorization Coach. And I'm going to go ahead. All I've done so far is run npm install to make sure the dependencies are met. And now I'm going to just run the program and show you the application a little bit. So this application is just a tool to help you memorize some piece of content that's important to you. You can set up a schedule Of course, you can log in, you can register. Right now, there's 4 training programs to help you memorize things. You can memorize things like prayers or scripture, or if there's a poem or a famous quote you want to memorize. And any one of these can run at any given time. You just have an editor here, and you can select times of the day that you want it to pop up with a message. So if we add a time here and save this, this is the running program. So we get a pop-up message here shortly, or we should, just with our content, just to help us remember or reread through it at some interval. So it's really just an editor and a login system and just a service to alert when certain time has passed. So let's look at what the source code looks like behind this application. And if we look here, we see we've got an app.js file. And so here, so you can see this is just popped up when the time expired. So let's take a look at this app.js file, top of our application, and we'll see that it's just wrapped in an IFI. And we can see we've got our classic configuration and route configuration all in our app.js file, right? And if we start to look at the folder structure here, we can see that it's organized by Angular component type. And let's take a look at our index.html file. We can see here that we've got a few style sheet dependencies. We've got our bootstrapping that occurs in the document. And then we've got all of our script tags to pull in our code and make sure that it's all sequenced properly. So this would be kind of how we used to write AngularJS maybe a couple of years ago. And notice we're still using IFIs for everything, right? So we've got these functions. These files are all insulated from the global scope simply by this technique here. So So what do we want to try to do if we want to start to upgrade this? Well, there's actually some help online on the Angular.io website that's pretty decent. If you just go to Angular.io and type in upgrade in their search box, you'll see they've got a guide article here that's upgrading from AngularJS. And they do a pretty good job here, especially in the first half of this, of giving you an overview of what you need to think about. So there's the preparation, which is what we're doing a little bit of right now. So they recommend you follow the style guide to transform your code a little bit. And then using a module loader. And we talked about this. We're going to do this with require.js. We'll introduce that. And then migrating to TypeScript. So we're going to do this a little bit. We're going to introduce the TypeScript configuration, but not necessarily worry so much yet about migrating it, because we just want to get to the point where we can start upgrading. Using component directives, they recommend, and that's something we covered a little bit in last week's episode. And then eventually we get down to this upgrading with ngUpgrade. And these are essentially the steps I'm going to show you, where we just try to follow their advice here to get to this point where we can run both of these simultaneously. So I'm going to set up the project. I'm going to pull in a different version of the project that has that second phase that we looked at earlier. So, and that phase, that's going to essentially have our introduction of our require.js, which is our module bundler, as well as TypeScript. So let's take a look at that, what it looks like. So if we look again at our index.html file, let's look at what the impact is there just by adding this module bundler. What we can see is we've now got just one script tag, and that pulls in our require.js module bundler, and it points to this main module, this main.js file, which is the configuration for require.js. So that would be similar to your configuration for system.js if you were using system.js as your bundler. And then we're able to remove all of these script tags that I had manually sequenced here. And how do you do that? Well, you describe those same dependencies through a configuration file. And in this case, this is our main.js file. And require.js just has a configuration, and then it has an execution. So this is the entry point for the application now. It'll be managed by require.js, and it'll essentially, require.js will make sure all of these files are loaded first. And once all of that is downloaded, and that doesn't mean run, it just means that they are downloaded from the server to your client. Once that's done, this block of code can run. And notice here, we've manually bootstrapped now our app to our document through this line of code, which meant that we could remove that. We had to actually remove that from the body tag to make sure we're not bootstrapping it from the document anymore using the ngApp directive. So the other thing we introduced in this version to prepare this code is TypeScript configuration. And we did that simply by introducing this tsconfig JSON file. What we've got here is compiler options. We've selected AMD because I'm using require.js. So I'm telling TypeScript essentially to bundle its output as AMD modules. These other items look similar, right? So we want to compile down to ES5 from TypeScript or from anything we're compiling with TypeScript. The allow.js will allow it to take my existing application JS files and put them along with anything else that's transpiled into the output directory build. So essentially means it will include just my raw JS files. Otherwise, TypeScript compiler is going to ignore your files because they're not star.ts files. So it's just going to ignore them. It assumes they're not meant to be worked with. And that's it, really. The other things here are just to specify some types and make sure that TypeScript can find the types that are defined in libraries. So I'll go ahead and run TypeScript to build the output just by running tsc. That just transpiles any TypeScript files. And that output this build folder here, which if we look at it is really identical to our original project, right? So there's really no difference here because we haven't introduced any TypeScript code yet. So I'm going to go ahead and run that and just make sure it's running. So this should, see if I refresh this. Yes, so this is down, and then I'm going to go ahead and run our new version and just to check that it's running. Okay, so it looks like there's trouble. Oh, and I think I know I needed to install require.js, so I need to do an npm install. So I updated this package.json to include require.js, but I had yet to install it. So remember, this version of the project, at this point, the preparation we've done so far is just introduce a module bundler, require.js in this case, and TypeScript configuration. Let's go ahead and check, see if it's running. Yes, okay, so we've got that version running now. So now that we've prepared the project with the loader and TypeScript config, we're ready to install Angular and ngUpgrade. So I'm going to start by installing all of the Angular platform packages. And I'm going to paste this in here, just talk through it a little bit. There's a list here, right? We've got Angular Core, Angular Common, Compiler, Platform Browser, Browser Dynamic Core, Zone. So I wanted to tell you where I got all those from. And those are from the GitHub project that they refer to on this upgrade article on Angular IO. So they say selectively copy code from the QuickStart GitHub repository. So go here whenever you need to find, what exactly do I need to have just as a baseline to get my Angular part of my project working. So we'll go ahead and run that, and this take a little while just to install all of these pieces.
Hey, Denny, I noticed when I switched over and started using this, and especially same thing with Webpack, right? Around the time I started using Angular 2 and Webpack, I started noticing that my node modules folder was getting a little bit crazy. So if it looks like there's a lot of stuff that we're installing, the tree shaking kind of is going to be happening here. So all that stuff won't necessarily be loaded into our project, right? I mean, all that NPM node stuff is, or the NPM node, I mean, the node module stuff just kind of sits there unless it's needed, which is the beauty of the modules in the first place, right?
Right. Yeah, and I'm not sure about tree shaking. When I think of tree shaking, my experience with it with Angular has been that Webpack is outstanding for that. So I'm not sure that what I have here now would handle that. I think it's still very much up to the developer at this point. But yeah, it's the node modules we're using here are really just to, well, actually, it's a good point, Bonnie, because the Angular compiler itself, when it's running, will not pull in anything from those libraries that it doesn't need, right, within the project. That's why you have your imports and exports. So I think you're right.
That's what I was thinking, because when I first saw that, you know, all this stuff that was being loaded, I was like, man, my project's going to be huge, right? But the thing is, when you compile it, it just takes that small amount and it serves it for your distribution. It's not necessarily as big as and that was kind of something that I had to adjust my way of thinking, because I was looking at this going, what the heck? But it's really, I mean, now I'm used to it, especially because, you know, I use the Angular CLI and, you know, I don't even have to think about this stuff. There's this Webpack, it's all under the hood. I don't even have to open it. But that was just kind of something that I had to adjust my thinking when I first started. So when I remembered when I saw that big long NPM install that you did, that I was like, it's fine.
That's right. Yep. Okay, so we've got our Angular platform installed in our project, right? We've got our AngularJS code, and now we're ready to install the upgrade library. And we do that just by simply installing the @angular/upgrade package. And you mentioned Webpack, and so Webpack is a bundler doing some of that tree shaking for you. That part being included with the Angular CLI really makes the CLI appealing, right? It abstracts away a lot of that configuration, because here we are manually configuring our module bundler. We're manually running the TypeScript compiler. Those are things you can avoid if you're using the Angular CLI, right?
For me, the Angular CLI was one of the many reasons to upgrade, just for that.
Yep.
Just don't tell Mike Brocky, because we don't want him to get a big head. But it's kind of beautiful. I mean, I feel spoiled now. I've been using it for a while, and it's the same thing with Webpack. Like, once you get used to it, it's like, how did I ever work without this? It's really nice.
Yeah, it is. Okay, so we installed Angular. We've installed the upgrade module, the ngUpgrade library, and now we're ready to introduce our first Angular file, the actual Angular module that will take over bootstrapping our project. And so we're going to create a new file called appmodule.ts, and this is our first TypeScript file. And I'm just going to copy and paste almost exactly what is in the article on Angular.io into this. It's very simple. It just pulls in some of the dependencies from the framework and runs this bootstrap line here. Now we're seeing these red lines because TypeScript can't recognize some of these types. So let's go to our tsconfig file and add in a declaration which will tell it how to find those dependencies. So if we update that, we can go back here and check. These should disappear, and they do. And then we've still got one other one that is a little awkward that I ran into. It talked about this experimental support for decorators. And so it does give you the fix, set experimental decorators to true. So we'll just go over to our TypeScript config and set that as well. And I think when I looked at the GitHub starter project, QuickStart project, I saw this in their configuration as well. So that's
I was just going to ask you about that. So
yeah.
So you said they talked about Decorators. So you're talking about the GitHub QuickStart repo. So basically, every time you found something with red squiggly lines, you would go back and read it and find the answer there.
No, but through
not
comparing, no, not that easy. But through comparing their project setup, I could at least verify that, okay, yes, this is the right fix, or yes, this looks different, or I could at least find the gaps in what I may have come up with initially that didn't match exactly with what was on the QuickStart example. Does that make sense?
Gotcha. Yes. So you're comparing that. So you had the QuickStart example, and then what else were you comparing it to?
That was it. Just a quick start and reading through that article. So I'll just say this.
Oh, you got to read the article?
You got to read the article. At least the first half. So, yes.
Copy and paste it. Oh, let's go.
But yeah, I did try to stay here. Everything wasn't perfectly clear in reading this, but when you start trying to work it into your project, I think it becomes more clear. And it's nice to know there is a resource right here on the Angular website that is good enough to get you going, right? So that's why I keep referring to that.
Especially for those of us coming from AngularJS, if you have been around long enough to have read the original docs for AngularJS, you appreciate how hard they worked on Angular.io, because the documentation back then was kind of sparse, and now it's like they put a lot of work into that website. So it's definitely a good resource.
That's right.
Sorry, I'm not trying to sidetrack.
No, that's good. No, you're right. Yep, that's good. So we've got our module now, our top level Angular module, our first Angular file. There's one more file we need to add to complete this bootstrapping process through Angular. Again, this is covered in the website, so it's very easy just to follow that directly. And we're just going to add a file. It's a main.ts file in the example online, but in our case, we've got a main.js file being used by our module loader. So I'm just going to call this main.angular.ts, and it's going to be stored right along with my app.module. And again, I'm just going to copy and paste really directly what was from the website as the example, and that works as is. So we've got these two files now in Angular, written in Angular, that are going to take over the bootstrapping. But for that to happen, we need to remove the bootstrapping that's already happening. So we've got this bootstrapping here that's done with AngularJS. So I'm going to copy and paste an updated version of this file that I've got over on my other screen and just highlight the most impactful part of this. So my updated version of my module bundler, in the configuration, really all I did was add in some of the new Angular dependencies, and in the initialization routine, the entry point, I removed entirely the AngularJS bootstrap, because that bootstrapping is now going to be handled through my brand new main.angular module that I just introduced over here. So we see here, this is Angular's way to bootstrap a project through some top level module, and we've declared that as well. So our two new files will take over controlling that bootstrapping of the application. So the application will still be running with AngularJS, but it will no longer be started or entered through that channel. So now I'll run the TypeScript compiler again, because we've introduced these TypeScript files, and we'll take a look at the output. So in our build folder here, now we see beside our original code, which is still in AngularJS, we've got our actual Angular code, and it's been wrapped in an AMD form because we configured it to do that in that module form. So now there's a couple other changes that I saw in the AngularJS, or sorry, in the QuickStart project. And those were essentially a couple dependencies for the polyfills, I think is what they would call them. And these were, I found these in the index.html file in the QuickStart project. Otherwise, I would not have known to put these here. It's the zone.js and the shim. And I had to put these in before my module bundler takes over or I received an error. So place them accordingly. So there's one other thing that I had to do to get this project running, and I'm going to cover it here. My solution I don't think is the best, but I want you guys to know about this because I have a feeling anytime you try to upgrade, you're going to run into something that's going to feel or seem kind of awkward. And what I ran into was that when I try to run AngularJS, and actually, let me try to run this project, and maybe I can show you what I ran into. Okay, so yes, when I first started running this project as is, where I thought I had accounted for everything, I received a lot of error messages related to observables and subjects and a lot of the stuff that's related to the RxJS library. And what I came to find out was that the RxJS library does not have an AMD module bundle available for use. And so that ended up being my problem. So to solve that, I thought, well, geez, I've got require.js here, and I've got my TypeScript transpiler that can bundle things as AMD. So I'm just going to see if I can include that into my application source code. So that's what I'm going to do here. I'm just going to create a new directory, RxJS, and I'm going to make a copy of the source code from the RxJS library.
That's such a good point. I wouldn't even have thought of that because I didn't learn about RxJS until I upgraded. So for people who want to use it now and still are using AngularJS, that's a really good, good catch there.
So basically what I've done here is just include all of the RxJS source code, which is written in TypeScript, into my source repository, which is going to be transpiled. So I'm just going to rerun the TypeScript compiler, and it's going to go ahead and produce an AMD version of each one of these files. Again, not the best solution, but it gets this project running, at least in the interim. And we now have this RxJS folder, and we've got these, you can notice if you're familiar with AMD, you'll notice this syntax. So there we go. So let me try this once more. I think we'll receive one more error that I want to show you as well. Yeah, so this was the other strange error I got, which was can't resolve all parameters for app module. And I went again to look at the QuickStart project in their TypeScript configuration to see what that might mean. And essentially what I found was that they had an additional attribute in there called emit decorator metadata set to true. And when I recompile this, I think we'll eliminate that error. So it's recompiled and we'll refresh, and I think we're back. So our application works again. And there we go. We've now got a AngularJS code base that we've not touched at all. We've just built around it some Angular structure and bootstrapping. And so we're ready really to begin. I'm going to run one quick test here, and then Sam will probably go into more detail on this. But so I'm going to just add a Angular component real quickly. Just call it footer. I just want to test to make sure that things are running like I think they should.
I'm sitting on the edge of my seat. It's stressful because you're live coding and then you just go, I'm just going to add one more thing, and that's always where it goes horribly wrong.
Right.
So You've got this, Denny.
Right. So all I'm doing here is adding an Angular component, and then I'm going to bring it into the application module, or the app module. If you're familiar with Angular, you know that you've got to pull in your components into your module, and then you have to declare them. And then, let's see here, it looks like, okay, it's complaining about Angular because I don't have that type installed, but I think we'll still be okay with it compiling.
If not, it'll be my fault because I jinxed you.
That's right. And then I'm just going to try to use this now. This will be the first change I've made to my AngularJS code. And I'm just going to go to one of the views and essentially add in this component, which is an Angular component, right? It was written in Angular. It's over in the Angular Typescript land. I'm just going to try to use that in my AngularJS template. So
this is crazy.
Yeah.
This is actually cool because up until now, it's like we have all the background for the series, and now like we actually get to see the code. This is like the fun part.
That's
Except
right.
it's hard to get to this point, but
yes.
I'm glad you went through all that pain for us.
That's right. You have to understand some of those pieces before you can start using it. It just takes that investment of time. So we've got our footer here. It's showing up, and so we confirm that that works. So yeah. So
Yay!
We should have confetti.
Right. I'm just as amazed. So we will, now that we've seen how to install it, Sam can show us how to start using this ngUpgrade to do some things, to actually iterate through our code and start downgrading components and upgrading services. And he's going to talk about some of those specifics. So Sam,
that was really cool, Denny.
Wow. Great. Yeah, that was great stuff, Denny.
Oh, good. Thanks.
I haven't seen someone do it that way, so that's really interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, I have my own style, right?
Yeah, everybody figures it out their own way, but it works. That was pretty cool, and it was cool to see like kind of the process of what the errors you went through that you had to resolve. Except here, it's like really cool because you know the answer, and it's like, oh yeah, I just do this, and then it works.
Yeah, that's
it never happens that fast when I do stuff like this.
Yeah, it didn't happen fast, and that's why I did want to point out some of those things, like using a different module bundler, right, than the ones you see online, because I wanted to use what I was familiar with, but it introduces some extra complexity, right? Because then you're thinking, well, what am I missing here? How come this isn't working quite the same way that it seems to in their demonstration, right? But I think that that's exactly what people are going to experience, and I think you're just going to have to be aware of that and just expect some of that.
That's awesome. Well, that was a really good demo. I'm going to switch presentation over to Sam.
Okay.
Okay.
Hello, Sam.
Oh, I'm on the big screen. That's exciting. Let me share my screen too. And oh boy. All right. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. Awesome. Yeah. So for those of you who don't know who I am Sam Julien, and I help run the ngPDX group in Portland. This is our awesome little logo with a tree because we're supposed to be Silicon Forest.
I like that, yeah.
And I work at a nonprofit in downtown Portland, and we have several large AngularJS applications that we've been slowly, methodically working on over the last few years, getting them to Angular. And I also do several other side projects that involve working on ngUpgrade. So I was really thrilled to be able to join in on this series of presentations because I feel like I've spent hundreds of hours working through this stuff, and to be able to pay that forward to anybody, if I can save anybody an hour or two, that would make it all worth it.
Yeah, that's right. Yep. I'm sure you can.
So, so I call this kind of pragmatic ngUpgrade. And so today, what I'm going to cover, since we can't possibly cover everything, but is kind of my upgrade strategy, which is really just a quick review of what Denny's covered in the last few weeks. Because it turns out we've separately in 2 different parts of the country have had really similar philosophies on ngUpgrade, which is really encouraging because it feels like if you're doing this alone and then other people are doing the same thing somewhere else, it means maybe that you're getting something right, which is good. And then I'm going to walk through the different components of ngUpgrade. So I'll show downgrading services and downgrading components and what that all means, and then upgrading components and upgrading or providing services. So this is kind of how I feel when tackling something as large scale as upgrading an enterprise application to a totally different framework. Because I love Angular as much as the next person, but it's a vastly different experience than AngularJS, and there's a lot of tooling that has to be changed, and there's a lot of stuff around your build process and your deployment process that has to change as well. And that's all good in the end, but it is a lot. And so that's why I kind of take this pragmatic approach, because I don't know about, I would think most people have the same situation that I do in my day job, where everything has to be iterative and everything has to be continuously deployable. The idea of taking weeks or months to rewrite an essential piece of the business is just not even in the realm of possibility. If you tell the business like, hey, we're just going to take a couple months to completely rewrite this application for no perceived benefit to the users, you know, they don't get that at all. So this is just like a massive amount of technical debt that you have to work through over time. And so in the last year or so, probably the same time frame as Denny, my coworkers and I have been figuring that out. And so we've kind of come up with this plan that we can make everything continuously deployable and continuously deliverable while we work on the rest of the application. And it comes with its own set of challenges, but we kind of divided it into 2 phases. The first one is kind of the last few weeks. I call it the 4 building blocks. You've got your file structure, which is the one component per file, one type per file, as well as breaking up everything by feature instead of by type. Then you've got your dependencies, so that means moving to NPM if you're using something like Bower or script tags or something like that. And then there's app architecture, which is your component structure, and that's what Denny covered last week. And then there's the build process, which we've also talked about. I was coming from Gulp previously, and now I've moved on to Webpack. So I'm just going to breeze through all that because that's kind of what we've covered before. But in my experience, and I don't know about others, but I kind of made this little chart of the time and disruption that it takes for these 4 building blocks, where the file structure doesn't take much, the dependencies don't take much, the architecture takes some time, but you can do it really slowly if you need to. And then the build process is kind of the big, horrible thing that you have to just do with TypeScript or Webpack or the CLI or whatever you choose to do. But then after that, the complexity drops dramatically, and ngUpgrade is actually not that complicated. There's the setup and the bootstrapping and all of that, but then there's sort of a well-defined route that you can take to start working through your component architecture and working through each route. And it kind of looks like this. We just saw Denny do this install and bootstrap Angular and ngUpgrade. And then you kind of pick a route. In my experience, you pick a route, you work from the bottom up, and you rewrite and downgrade the services in that route. And then you rewrite and downgrade the components in that route. And then if you have an AngularJS component that needs to be used inside of an Angular component, then you would upgrade it. So I'm gonna go into all these in more detail. And then you can upgrade or provide services as necessary. That just means if there's an AngularJS service or a third-party dependency or even a service within your own application that for whatever reason has to stay as AngularJS, you can upgrade them in a way that I'll show you a little bit later. Then after you've done that, you iterate through all of your routes and repeat until everything is rewritten in Angular in that ngUpgrade style that I'll be showing you. And then you can switch to the Angular router and then eventually just drop everything related to AngularJS, all of the code and all of the dependencies. So in this brief time that we have, I'm going to be going through basically number 2 on here, where you pick a route and go through, and I'm going to show you a demonstration of each of those things, downgrading services, downgrading components, and then upgrading components and services. So before I do that, I'll give you a little tour of the little application that we'll be working on here. And it's really interesting to see Denny's side project or little project, because it's so funny how much we have to do to problem solve as developers when we kind of start with what we know and then we go from there. And even though I came from kind of a totally different setup and build structure, I ended up having to do a lot of those same kind of workarounds and things like that. So what I've got is a much simpler application than what Denny has, but it's just a little order system. At this phase, it's just pretty much displaying data, but there's a customer's route with customer detail, a products route, and an orders route. A little bit later in the life of the application, it gets a little bit fancier. But at this phase, this is basically what it is. And we're going to be going through this customer's route and just changing what we need to. And switching over to the code. So the way I have this set up is this is not a CLI project. This is an AngularJS project that has recently had Angular and ngUpgrade installed, and it's using a fairly sophisticated Webpack build process that I hand rolled that uses composition and Webpack merge to be able to use different environments like dev and production. So this has an Express server running in the background that serves up the data for those routes, and then it's using the Webpack dev server for development, and then you can run a prod build to run Webpack on the prod build. And the idea is that I've been trying to use this application as a way to figure out how at each step along the way I can make something that's deployable to production and that's usable and that doesn't break anything. And that's been quite an adventure to be able to try and do that and implement it in my day job as well. I wanted to point out one other thing. I ran into a lot of the same issues that Denny did. The one thing that I ran into that I'm not even sure if it's still pertinent, but I found, let's see, in the in main.ts, I ran into a problem where it wasn't loading the right version of AngularJS unless I actually specified it, and I had to use this set Angular lib method that Angular provides and pass in the version of Angular. And I don't know if that's specific to using Webpack along with ngUpgrade or what, but it was kind of a weird thing that I found buried somewhere in documentation or Stack Overflow or something. So just in case that benefits anybody down the line. And then I also ran into the polyfill issue with Zone.js and reflect metadata, having to make sure I import those. So when you go off the beaten path of the CLI, which a lot of times you have to do for existing large projects in the enterprise world, you run into a lot of weird stuff and kind of have to just power through it. So that's our little sample application that we'll be working on. So let me switch back over to the slides. Ooh. Not the infinite regression of Hangouts. So I find that it's generally best to, when you started a route, to go to the services first and use ngUpgrade to downgrade the service in that route. And that way you're starting with, you're kind of starting at the bottom of the dependency tree. So this is fairly straightforward. It's especially straightforward if you've already been using ES6 classes. I should have mentioned that when I was showing the code. This particular demo project I've been working through for a while, and everything is in TypeScript and ES6. It's not really TypeScript per se, it's really just using the TypeScript compiler, but it's using things like ES6 classes in order to take advantage of Webpack for module bundling. So downgrading services is much simpler if you've already written the class as the service as a class. Although it's not necessary, you can do that at the same time that you need to do it. So you rewrite it as a class, then you use ngUpgrade to downgrade the class and provide it to AngularJS basically, and then you move the service from being in the module file for AngularJS, if that's the structure that you're using, to the Angular module. Let me go back to that. So rewrite as a class, downgrade it, and then basically move it from AngularJS to Angular. So provide it to the Angular module file. And just one or two things on here. When you're downgrading a service, so I love observables as much as the next guy, and I've given talks on them here in town. But there's such a drastically different way of looking at your data that it can kind of be a pain to jump into observables right away, because it might break so many other components that are using promises or expecting a .then or something like that, that can often feel really overwhelming if you feel like, oh man, all of a sudden HTTP is returning an observable instead of a promise, and now all of my components that depend on that service are broken. You don't have to do that. You can use toPromise, and I'm going to show you that, so that you can kind of ease the transition to using observables. You can make everything a promise at first, and then once you've identified all the dependencies on those services, you can convert one call at a time back to an observable, just removing the toPromise operator. And that way you can kind of do this slowly in a way that's not going to disrupt your application. So let's go take a look at that. How's it go? Am I moving too fast, or how's it going?
No, it's great.
I was just going to comment that I've done stuff like that, not necessarily with promises, but when I'm upgrading a service slowly, I'll usually give it another method name that's really similar, and that way I can kind of keep track without breaking anything. I can say return observable, with a different method, and that way everything that I have works, and then going forward I can just flip it to the new method as I refactor. Yeah,
that's another great idea. So here I've got just the customer service, and it's already an ES6 class, and there's just a get and a get with an ID and then a post. And so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to export this class, and I can actually get rid of this default down here, and I can get rid of the $inject for $HTTP, because we're going to be using Angular's HTTP service. So I can rename, I'm going to rename $HTTP to HTTP, which is the Angular version of the $HTTP service. So I can just be real clever and do a find and replace here. And then I'm going to start importing my types, because TypeScript doesn't have any idea what HTTP is. So there's a few things that I need to import. So any service is going to need this injectable decorator that tells it that dependencies can be injected into it. And that is from Angular core. And then services need the HTTP service, and then they also need this type of response. So from the HTTP library, I'm going to import HTTP and response. So, and now I can specify the type here of HTTP. Then I can also take advantage of a little TypeScript shortcut, and instead of declaring the property here and then setting it on line 7, I can get rid of that and use the private keyword. And that's basically the same. So now we've got our customer service class, we're exporting it, and we've set our HTTP variable. I'm also going to add, I'm going to go ahead and add that injectable type, that metadata decorator up here. And that injectable decorator doesn't get called with any options or anything. You just call it like that. So now you can see we've got these red squiggles under our calls. And one thing I love about TypeScript is that the red squiggles are basically your friend, because it's now helping you code with IntelliSense. So this is telling us that then doesn't exist on the type of observable of response. So it's letting us know that a HTTP GET is actually going to return an observable of our response object. So that's super handy. So I mentioned before that we don't necessarily have to use these as observables. So we can actually use RxJS's toPromise function to let us keep using these as promises as a temporary measure. So we need to do two things. We need to import observable. So we need to import observable from, and that's from RxJS/Rx. And then we also need to import the toPromise operator. So I'll say import.
Hey, Sam.
Yeah.
One thing that I've been doing with RxJS is instead of importing it from Rx, which is because if you bring in Rx, it's huge, right? It's massive. What you can do is you can do RxJS/observable, and then you're just picking up that, and you're going to keep your bundles smaller.
Oh, okay, yeah. Yeah, I've seen it two or three different ways. And I knew that about the operators, but I didn't know that about observable. I'll have to...
You should be able to just do, on line 4, you can remove the Rx at the end and just put RxJS/observable, and that should work the same.
That?
Just, no, it needs to be capitalized.
Okay.
Yeah, capitalize it.
Oh, we'll give it a shot. Awesome. That'd be great.
Yeah, it's just smaller.
Yeah. So then down here in each of these calls, I can just add that toPromise operator, and that'll let us just keep everything to be the same. And then lastly, this .data doesn't exist anymore on that response object, so we need to call that JSON method on the response to go ahead and map that to a JSON object. We can do that on all three of these. So now we basically just made an Angular class, which is great, but now we need to actually use it in our application. So this is where we'll get to actually use the ngUpgrade library. So of course, we need to import more things because that's the name of the game in Angular. So I'm going to import something called downgrade injectable, and that's from the Angular upgrade static library. These imports can be really tough to remember in the beginning, but once you've done them a bunch, then you'll start to pick it up over time. For historical reasons, there's 2 ngUpgrade libraries, and you want to be importing from the static one because it has better support for AOT and a couple of other things. So you'll see me importing from the static library. And then we also need to declare this variable of Angular. So I'm going to declare our Angular, and that's of type Angular.iAngularStatic. And that's going to let us actually register this component on our application. So once we've imported that, now we actually have to use them. So down at the bottom of our file, I can just say Angular.module_app, and then all the downgraded services are actually going to be factories. So I'll say .factory, and then I'll pass in the same name that I was calling it in AngularJS. So pass in whatever string you're already calling it in AngularJS. So in this case, I'm just calling it customer service. And then I can pass in our downgrade injectable function. And inside of that, I just pass our class. So I'll pass the customer service class. And now we've got our class rewritten and downgraded. So now we just need to do this service hokey pokey and move. The way I have this set up is I have an AngularJS module that imports all of the different components and then registers them on the application. And this was just a way to help keep track of which things have been upgraded and which ones haven't. So anything on here is purely still in AngularJS. And so I can just remove the customer service from there, which means I also need to remove it from our registration. And then I need to go over to our Angular module. Now for the first service that you import, you also need to import the HTTP module. Because of the way Angular works, it's all pieced together and you import it one thing at a time. We've talked about that before. So just like with the form module, if you're using forms, you have to import that. So you have to import the HTTP module for the first service that you're downgrading. It's just from Angular/HTTP. And then I can add that to our imports. Now we can actually import the customer service and register that on our ng module. So I'll just import customer service from /customer/customer service. And since this is the first service, I need to make an array of providers. So providers are basically the services that we use in our application. So I can just add customer service as a provider. And that's everything that we need to do. We actually don't need to change anything in our AngularJS code. It'll just do it for us. So if I
just love how you guys are walking through these live demos tonight and making it look so easy. We're going to this is, and you can tell from the complexity of this code that it wasn't that easy.
Yeah,
it just looks so effortless.
I know. That's what happens when you spend hundreds of hours like crying in the middle of the night trying to get these things to work.
Well, hopefully we'll save someone the agony.
I hope so. I hope so. That's my main goal. But yeah, you can see now I've refreshed the page and we're still getting our data in from the server. And you can actually see in my Webpack source control. Where is it? It's going to prove to you that, oh, weird. All right. Well, never mind. No proof, but yeah, my Webpack dev server is running on port 9000 and we're getting our data back that way. So that is using, you can see that so our home component was already converted and now we've got our service converted and everything's still working. So awesome. And now we can move over back to the slides. Okay, so once you've got your service converted, you can start working through the components. And downgrading components is sort of the fastest way to do this, where you basically rewrite your component as an Angular class, and then you downgrade it. It's a very similar process to what I just showed you with the services. And then you do the same hokey pokey of removing it from your AngularJS module and adding it to your Angular module. And you add it to both your entry and your declarations. And that's something that took me forever to figure out, is that if you downgrade a component, you always add it to both your entry and your declarations on your module. For whatever reason, downgraded components are always considered entry components. So pro tip. And I should say with the whole like AngularJS module file, if you don't have a separate module file, The point is just that you don't register the same thing twice. So you could kind of do it however you want. If you want to do all the upgrading and downgrading imports in one place, that's fine. I just find that it's easier, especially if this is a big application. I want something that jumps out at me that says like, this is a downgraded component, like so that in the future, when I need to go and remove it, I can come back and just remove it from that one place, and I don't have to worry about it. And then after you actually update the code itself, then you just need to update the templates to Angular syntax. And most of that is pretty straightforward. Most of that is pretty easy. There are a couple of things that I've come across. The first thing is, one of the things, we talked about this a little bit last week, but one of the things that made AngularJS so popular and magical was all the two-way data binding and all the magical things like filters, like the order by filter and the filter and all this stuff that was happening on the template that was seemed like magic at the time. And that's because it was really expensive and was taking a lot of resources. So that's the one trick that you're going to have to worry about. Is it? I know with one of our big applications, we've got those filters littered like everywhere, like all over the place. And so you have to actually rewrite that logic on the component. Now, luckily, it's not that complicated. And once you figure it out in one place, then you can basically extract that into something that you can use all over your application. But that's just one thing to keep in mind, is that you won't be able to just directly translate those things like the filter and the order by filter into Angular. Otherwise, a lot of it is pretty straightforward, and there's that one documentation piece on Angular.io that is kind of a cheat sheet. It's called the Angular cheat sheet, and you can search through and find things like ngRepeat maps over to ngFor and things like that. And I think we've shown that before on here. If you work up the chain of dependencies, now tonight I'm actually gonna do the opposite, because I want to be able to show you upgrading a component. So I'm going to first downgrade the customers component and then upgrade the customers table component. In reality, I would never do that, because that just doesn't make any sense. It makes a lot more sense to go from the innermost component to the outermost component and just wrap your AngularJS in Angular upwards through the chain. That just saves you a lot of time. So let's just go right into it. So I've got this route is broken into a larger customers component that just then contains this table. And so normally I would just downgrade the customers table first, but I want to show you actually. So if I didn't already say this, downgrading means that you're writing an Angular component and then making it available to AngularJS, which means that you would have an Angular component being accessed by AngularJS, whether that's by the router or by another template. Whereas upgrading means that you're providing an AngularJS piece to Angular, and that's the other way around. So let's open up the customers component. And this is following, so it's already like the customers component object, and it's exporting it. And so now we're gonna change this to a class, and this also has $on_init, so we need to take that into account as well. So the first thing I need to do is import component and on_init from Angular core. So import component and on_init Angular core. And then I'm going to change this function to a class. So I can export a class, and I'll just rename it to customers component. We don't really need the controller anymore. And then I'm going to take out this little thing, this customer service, and make that into a constructor. So make that into a constructor. And now I'm going to replace this customers component object and this $inject with our component decorator. So I'll just type @component. And this one does take an options object. And the first one is a selector. And I'm just going to call this customers. So, and I think you've covered this before, but the selector in Angular is different than the string name in AngularJS, whereas the selector is actually literally the tag that you're going to use, where as opposed to the name that you register in AngularJS that automatically gets hyphenated. And we'll see that in the customers table. And then I need to specify the template, which is just going to be, I'm using Node and Webpack to load in the templates this way. So I can actually just specify that the template is our template constant right there. I can get rid of all of our references to VM, which is a shout out to John Papa Style Guide. And I'll specify the private keyword here for the customer service. I can also get rid of this export default down there. Now for our on a init, we need to use so on init is now an interface. All these lifecycle hooks that were in AngularJS are now interfaces that we use. So we would say that the class of the customers component actually implements on init. Now here's something really cool. Typescript knows what to do here. So it's telling us that ng on init is missing in the type of customers component. So if you want to get real clever, you can click on this light bulb and it'll generate it for you. I'll move it down a little bit. But underneath our constructor, you can see it's pretty similar to what we were doing before, which was just declaring a function called $on_init and putting it on the view model and then going and getting our customers data. So I can just copy that over here and delete that. Oops, I think I got rid of one extra. Okay. And then we just need to, TypeScript is telling us to be sure to use this on our class. So I just say this. And the same thing with our customers data here. And I didn't actually declare a property of customers. So I'm going to use TypeScript to declare our property. You can also get fancy with this and make a customer's interface that defines what the customer is and use that here. But since we're taking the path of least possible resistance, we just won't worry about that right now. Okay, so now we've converted it, and now we need to actually downgrade it. So very similar to what we did before. I'll just copy and paste this to save us a little bit of time here. But we're importing downgrade component from Angular Upgrade static, and then declaring our Angular variable. And now we can downgrade it so that we can provide it to our application. So we'll say module app. And downgraded components are directives. So just like services get downgraded to factories, components get downgraded to directives. And we'll use the string of customers and then pass in downgrade component. And downgrade component takes an object, and that object has a key of component, and then we pass in our class of customers component. And then lastly here, we have to actually do some typing here, and we need to say that this is as angular.iDirective factory. Let me break this up a little bit better. See that. So we've registered a new directive on our application called customers. We're passing in downgrade component with component and passing in our class, and then casting it as angular.iDirective factory. That's basically all we need to do on our actual component. Now we just need to do what we did before and take it off of our AngularJS module and add it to our Angular module. So I'll just pop over here, and I can remove this from line 13 and also remove line 31. And now in our app module, we can just import component. And like I said, we need to add it to both our declarations and our entry components array. Okay, now if I've done this right, we should just see template errors in our application. So let's open that up. No.
Sam, on the dependency for on the component, the service I think didn't have a type on it in the constructor.
Oh yeah.
916.
You're right. I need to import the customer service. And then specify that type. Good call, Denny. Okay. Now we should see. Okay, yeah. So now you can see the errors say template parse error, customers table is an unknown element. That's good because that means that the component is actually loading, but when it tries to load the template, it's coming across things like $CTRL, which we don't want. So now we would just go over to the template. Oh, wrong template. We go over to this template, and all we need to do right here is get rid of the $CTRL. Now, this, I don't think this is going to load because the customers table hasn't been upgraded. Correct. Because customers table hasn't been upgraded, it doesn't know what we're talking about, which is exactly why we would have started with the customers table and downgraded that first. But that's less fun than being able to upgrade live as well. So great. So now that brings us to upgrading components. What a great segue. So upgrading components would be using the AngularJS components within Angular components. So in this example, the customers table needs to be used within the customers component. And so it's pretty similar. It's a little bit different in that what we're going to do is actually create an Angular directive. We're going to actually leave the AngularJS component exactly the way it is, but create another Angular directive in the same file just right on top of it. And then we can actually import that into the Angular module, and it gets used the same way. So then you would just use it the same way, you just adjust your template syntax. And this can throw people off sometimes where when you're downgrading or upgrading, you start using the Angular syntax instead of the AngularJS syntax, which can be a little confusing, but it's mostly not that difficult to convert it over. And I think that the Angular template syntax is actually a lot more logical than the AngularJS template syntax. Whoops. So, okay, so let's go do that with the customers table. So I'm going to open up the customers table component. And this is just a dumb component. When we talk about component architecture, like what Denny talked about last week, this customers table component knows nothing. All it knows is that it's getting a binding of customers, and then it's displaying them on the page in a template. So let's go ahead and redo this. I'm going to paste in all of the imports because they take forever to type, but you're basically importing these things. Directive, element ref, and injector are used to build the directive, and then the input is used to do our binding here. And then I need to, because I'm going to be exporting two different things from here, I can get rid of this export default and instead export our constant here. And that's just a subtle change because exporting a default means that there's one thing in the file, but I'm actually going to be exporting both the AngularJS component and the Angular directive. I suppose you could break this into two different files. That just seems kind of unnecessary, especially for a component of this size. I guess if it was a really big component, you might want to break it into two different files, but it seems like for keeping track of which things are downgraded and upgraded, I just keep it all the same. And I'm going to actually paste in, just for the sake of time, I'll paste in the directive, and we can just go through it one piece at a time. So basically, we make another class. We export a class called customers table directive, and then that extends this thing called upgrade component that we imported up there. And the most important part of this is this constructor. So the constructor is taking the element and the dependency injector and calling this super on customers table and kind of angularizing it. So basically this kind of just makes a shim of the Angular directive over top of the AngularJS component, and just tells it when it sees the tag of customers table to use this directive instead, which is pretty clever. And then for our binding, since the customers is an input and it's a one-way input, we just call this input just like we would on an Angular class and say that we have customers. And again, if we had an interface for customers, we could use that here as well. And then to actually use this, we just need to import it in our declarations in our module. So I'll hop over here and import customers table directive from customers table. And then this actually only needs to be specified in the declarations. We don't need to specify it in the entry components, which is one other thing to remember. Great. And so again, theoretically, we should be getting template parsing errors. If I refresh this, it should be griping at us about ngRepeat and things like that. Property controller of undefined. Hang on. Oh, I know what I need to do. I forgot, because I changed that export default to export the constant, I got to go fix that in the AngularJS module. Okay. And now, yes, okay. So now it's griping at us about ngRepeat and things like that. So we can fix this syntax. So a couple things, there's actually only two things that we need to do. We need to replace this ngRepeat with ng4, which is just star ng4, and then let customer of, get rid of the $CTRL, and then we can actually just get rid of this nghref altogether. And then update customers template. And let's see what's going on. Something Chrome something. What have I done? Standby. There's probably a random typo somewhere.
This is the danger of live coding.
Ah, yes, the live coding gods are angered.
It happens to all of us. It just doesn't normally happen, you know, on camera. So it's always
yeah. Let's do some live debugging and see what's happening.
This is where it gets good, you guys.
Okay, so it's coming in our ng on a init. Let's see what happens when this is loading. I feel like I came across this earlier and I should have written down what it is that I did to fix this. Downgrade component.
It's always harder when you're sharing your screen.
Customers component. Well. Oh, I know. It's because I am not. Let's, for funsies, let's change this to an observable, because I can actually fix this faster with an observable. So to use this as an observable, we just need to do two things. We need to get rid of this toPromise and instead use RxJS's map function, which means I need to import it. I can just do the same thing with toPromise. I can just import map. And then in the component, instead of doing .then, I just do .subscribe. And voila, now you're using an observable. So now let's see if that fixed anything. No. Awesome. Okay. What is happening?
I have run into, and this might not be the problem here, but I have run into a couple of things where sometimes I'm coding and certain things that I do, I have to restart my server or my, my NPM. And the problem is that I forget that and I start debugging. And I've had a couple of times, actually once last week, where I spend 30 minutes debugging it and then I remember that I need to restart my server and then it pops up and I'm like, and then I have to undo all those changes that I just tried. But I don't think that's usually when you're making changes to the structure. It's probably not the case.
It could be customers template. Odd. Hang on. Let me pull up another thing here. I could also just fast forward to the next commit on here and show you the working thing in case I missed something.
We don't mind. I mean, to me, when I know it's always stressful to live debug, but it's good. I mean, it's a good process to see, to kind of walk through what you're looking at.
Yeah, I suppose that's true.
Sonny did this a couple months ago, and he got stuck in it. It was actually a really good process to see how he would debug it and set breakpoints and stuff like that, and it was actually really helpful.
Yeah,
and luckily he had Denny who found the typo.
Yeah, exactly. Seems like it's something with the binding, maybe. Oh, I know what it is. Derp. This is a good lesson. Let this be a lesson to everybody. It's the binding on here. I forgot to update this. So you need to actually use the Angular brackets on here, because now this customers table is being looked at by Angular, not by AngularJS. So you have to actually.
Hold on. What? Can we look at the error message again?
Yeah.
Before you fix it.
It actually wasn't giving us any sort of error. All that was happening, if I hover over our view model, it's not binding anything. So the data wasn't getting. This is a stupid Chrome. I don't know what this is. This is like a Chrome extension thing, but the data wasn't being passed from the customers, the observable of the customers component to the customers table. So there's just no data being passed, and it wouldn't really matter if this was a promise or an observable. I was just kind of doing process of elimination there. So so there's no data being passed. And this is not, in the upgrade process, I have definitely found this to be one of those kind of like checking for typos. Go back and check your template because you might have missed something like this. So yeah, all you need to do is update this to be Angular syntax. So we need to put brackets around it, and we need to get rid of $CTRL because that's not in Angular anymore. So even though this is still an AngularJS component, it's being Angularified as a directive, and then when it's called, it's actually being called by Angular, not by AngularJS. So you need to use that syntax. So now, cross your fingers.
Is it gonna work?
didn't work. Well, why not? That doesn't make any sense. That actually should work. Customers table, customers. It's not our customers table. Really should have worked. Okay, now I'm confused. This is partially why I almost never do the upgrade part. I do the downgrade part because you can work from the bottom up. Man, this one has me stumped. Customer. Did I miss something in the syntax of the?
Well, let's look at
the CTRL. Should the $ CTRL still be there in front of the dot?
Can we go back into the component, into the and just put a console log? I mean, that's what and maybe that's not the coolest way to do it, but I just throw in a console log to see if the data's there in the component in customers table.ts.
Yeah. Customers table. So, it's undefined there.
Or how does that VM? I'm trying to figure out now. And how does this VM alias factor into the data once it's it's connected to this template now that has Angular syntax, but you're still using like AngularJS code to support it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm trying to figure out, well, how does that VM alias factor into the dot customers on the template of the, I guess, of the customers component, right? It's the customers component, the container component, not necessarily the table.
It shouldn't, because the binding is just getting passed in. I mean, you could even put, I mean, if you wanted to put vm.customers equals this.customers, you could.
Can you put it in the subscribe, the console log in the subscribe, and let's see if that's firing down in the nginit?
Yeah.
Because I'd be interested to see what's going on right there and just see that data.
Yeah, it's got it.
So there it is. It's
got the data on the it's not binding properly for some reason between the customers and the customers table. Customers dash table. Customer. I don't see any error there. Input of customers. Dang.
Is it line 9? I always had a hard time with that, the greater than.
No. It's definitely the less than. What did I do? Well, we might just have to move on.
Table. Go back to customer table, the HTML template.
Table, like customer of customers.
So
do you need to put the async in there? Because in the time that it takes the observable to come back, you might need an async pipe.
Maybe. I've never done that. I've never had to, but
because it's an observable, so when it first renders, it's not there yet.
No. Man, this did not happen earlier. I wonder what I did here.
This is where we need commercial breaks. We don't have commercial breaks on.
Yeah. This is live as it happens. Just.
Well, if you can put the console log in the subscribe and also in that function customers table, where is that? So the component.
Yeah, it's just not. Yeah, it's not binding it. Customers to customers.
It's been a while since I've done this syntax, so I'm not sure.
Okay, so I guess
Yeah.
Is that even necessary? Are we trampling over the binding through the constructor?
No, I mean that line was just to be
Okay.
just to give it a shot, but no, it's not necessarily.
And that data that's logging out, that's coming from our Angular customers.
Yeah, that's coming from here, from the customers component.
Okay. So we're getting that, just not feeding it to the template through there. This customers.
Which should be right there.
Spelling is it? No, seems okay. Customers.
This has got to be one of those things that's like really dumb, but it's just like something obvious.
I know, but I've had this problem before, and I'm just checking. I just pulled it up on the other screen. I went and checked the documentation, and your syntax looks right.
Yeah, I'm not seeing anything that's.
So your subscribe is working, and it's getting the data.
Is it okay? Sorry.
Go ahead.
Is it okay to use the same name as a property name and a name? Because we got a component name by the name of customers, right? And then we've got this property we're trying to feed into this. Also,
yeah, I mean, I've never had that happen before, but might as well give it a try. We can just change it to customers data here and here. Change it to customers data there. Change that to customers data, right? Is that all the things? I missed something. Customers data, customer. Oh, kebab case is different now, isn't it? Or if I change customers data.
No, I think it's still camel case.
Data. Oh, so you do it like this?
I believe so.
Still didn't like it. That's weird. Well, maybe I should just move on.
Can you have it in the GitHub? Can we pull that up real quick and look at that code and see?
Well, I didn't do. I changed this around to do the upgrade thing. So like in the GitHub, I have everything downgrade. I have the table component downgraded, and then the customers component downgraded.
So this is the in between.
Yeah, so this is the in between because I wanted to be able to. I wanted to demonstrate upgrading. So obviously that didn't go according to plan. That's.
Can you look at this file in your you have Tower?
Oh, what now?
You have Tower, or can you just look at this file and see what the correct syntax is? Instead of pulling your next commit, you can just peek at the answer.
No, that's what I'm saying. Like this was I have the master of this in another file, and it's like identical. I mean, I can just paste it in for fun to see.
Well, I'm just thinking we're running kind of long.
Yeah,
already.
I guess we'll just move. I mean, I could just move on to the next thing. It's not a big deal. Man, that's embarrassing. All right.
No, it's okay. It happens. So, but you can tweet it out later when you figure out what it was, and then we'll retweet it. So if anybody's watching, they can see. Because I'm sure as soon as you're not sharing your screen, you'll fix it.
Yeah, it's got to be.
How it works.
Yeah, that's like real weird. So we're gonna move on, and I'm just gonna discard everything and fast forward so we can get to the other stuff.
It's like Keith always tells me when I get stuck on something really silly, which does happen more often than I care to admit. He says, "This is a judge-free zone." He solved something for me last week, and I was like, "You could have made it look a little harder than that," because I was stuck on that for a long time. And he told me the answer in like 5 seconds. I was like, that's terrible."
Yeah. Fast forwarding. So what I had done previously was I downgraded the customer's table component and downgraded the customer's component. Because for exactly that reason, upgrading can, for some reason, cause weirdness that I don't normally see in other places. So let me just hop back to the slides and just real quick, we'll go over upgrading services. So when you're providing AngularJS services to Angular, there's a couple steps. You create a factory and a provider in a separate file, and then you import it into the Angular module, and then you use it in your component. So I would say both upgrading components and upgrading services are really a temporary stopgap. There, as you have seen, there can be weirdness with upgrading, and ultimately you're going to be rewriting it anyway. I would only do this as for things that are either built-in AngularJS services that you need temporarily, or for like really complicated services that you can't get to right away. Same with components. Like if you have a really complicated component that you need to upgrade, then that works. But most of the time, I prefer downgrading. It's just that that's not always possible. And then there's another thing that I'm not going to be able to cover tonight called injection token that you can use for third-party dependencies. I've got a link to an article that the ThoughtRam people wrote about that. So let me just show that really quick. So let me run. I got to get my server running again here, and then my Webpack build. Okay. So in the new world of the fast forwarded demo.
Look, he fixed it.
Yeah, exactly.
I wish I could fast forward in real life.
Yeah, right? Still bundling. Anyway, so what we're doing is in the orders component, which has already been converted and downgraded, we're using $location for now because we're still on the AngularJS router. And this is to get us to the, what's going on here? Oh yeah, this is to get us to our create orders route. So in order to fix this, we would need to provide the $location service to this Angular component. So to do this, one thing that people do is they keep all of these in one file. You don't have to do this, but I like to. So you call the file ajs.upgradedproviders.ts. And we need to first export a function that's a factory. So we'll say export function location service factory as a parameter of I, and it returns I.get $location. And this is like a factory for Angular's injector. And then we need to use this factory in a constant called location service provider. Now, some people also do this right in their module. They would just put this exact same thing in the module itself in the providers. I just find that gets really messy, so I do it separately. So first we provide a property called provide, and that's providing the token, that string of $location. And then there's a property called use factory, and that's where we call our location service factory. And then we have a deps array, which is dependencies, and we pass in $injector. And this will work for any of the AngularJS services. So now we can go over to our app module, and we just need to add that. So I like to do it kind of like in between. In case I have a lot of them, I can just import location service provider ./ajs.upgradedproviders. And then we'd add it to our providers array down here. And this is where you would see sometimes people do that whole constant here. They just put it all in the providers array, and that's totally fine. And now we can actually go to the orders component, use this, we need to add one import, which is we need to add something called inject. So we add that import, and then down in our constructor, we need to call that inject for our property for $location. So we just say @inject, and we need to pass in that string of $location. So this is basically telling Angular, like, okay, when you see $location, pass in $location from AngularJS. I also need to real quick fix one thing on here I'm noticing, is I need to get the order service real quick. It's that. Specify the type here. And then I need to fix one other thing, which is, sorry, some of my commits were not in the same order as my actual presentation, so just need to fix that real quick. Okay. And then I'm just gonna, there's a lot going on in this orders component, and we don't have time to go through all of it, so I'm just gonna comment out the table part of it, so we don't have to worry about that right now, because we just want to see that the button is working. So I'm going to comment out some of this stuff just for the sake of time.
Hey Sam, is this a repo that that we can share?
This particular one is not. This is a private one, but I'm planning on like tweeting out a public version of this in the near future.
Awesome.
Okay, so now we've got. What's going on? Oh gosh, man. All right. For the sake of time, I'm going to fast forward again because I don't have. We just can't sit here and debug all of this. So let me fast forward to head. And okay, so let's look at the finished code for this. So we've got our inject for $location here. And we've got our upgraded providers here. And then the module, oops, the other module at the location service provider there. Okay, now we've got an actual working application with everything loading. And if I click on create order, it actually takes us to our route. You can see this is also with all of the sorting and filtering has been updated as well. So this is all using Angular and not using AngularJS. So now we've got a pretty substantial hybrid setup here of the customers component and the orders components, both using Angular instead of AngularJS, including the $location service. And that's about it. So to summarize, you pick a route, you work from the bottom up. I gave you a real good example of why you would work from the bottom up and not try to downgrade. So you rewrite and downgrade your services, rewrite and downgrade your components, and then upgrade your components if you need to, and upgrade services if you need to. So the emphasis, I mean, for me personally, I've just found a lot. I found it a lot more helpful to do all the downgrading. It's easier to not break dependencies that way, but sometimes you don't have a choice. Sometimes logic is just too gnarly, or services are too big, or it's a third-party dependency that you need and you have to upgrade. And then you just repeat until everything is written, and switch to the router, and then remove everything. So a couple of other resources I found helpful other than the documentation. At ngConf, these two talks were really helpful. Asim Hussein's When You Can't Use the Word Big Bang was a really great talk and kind of informed my whole approach to using ngUpgrade. He calls it the plague model, which is basically starting from the bottom up and just letting Angular kind of infect your application from the bottom up. And that's an approach that I really have found helpful. And then Peter Bacon-Darwin gave this talk on just sort of a succinct overview of all of this stuff on upgrading and downgrading. And then for injection token, ThoughtRam has an article on injection token. And then if you're doing any sort of hand-rolled Webpack stuff, the Survive.js Webpack book is pretty fantastic. It talks about composition and things like that. And lastly, Sean Larkin has some resources on Webpack called Webpack Academy. And that's about it. So appreciate the time. Sorry that the upgrade demo didn't go well. That was a bummer, but you know, that's life. So
it's very difficult to live code. So if you can, it would be great if you could put up a public repo, just kind of to finish it, because I know people are following along, and then it's kind of hard to go, okay, well it worked at the end, but there was some magic that you did. So if you're able to put up a GitHub repo, then we could tweet it out for anybody following along. And because that's the thing is we all go through this. I've done stuff like this, and especially when you're doing the old AngularJS with the new Angular, and you have a problem and you try to Google it, like when you're kind of in that one leg on either side of the fence, it's so difficult to find the answer, because you either find old stuff or new stuff, and it's like you're threading the needle there. It's really difficult, and it's even more difficult when you're live coding with people watching you. It's very stressful. I can't even spell JavaScript when I'm sharing my screen. So
I know, right? Yeah,
if you could do a repo, that would be awesome.
Yeah, so the story is that so this is a private repo that I've been working through. I'm actually building a course on ngUpgrade that I'll be coming out with in the not too distant future, and so I'm going to be making a public version of this repo to go along with that, and so I'll definitely share that out there when the time comes, because yeah, the more sample code that's out there, the better when it comes to this stuff. So
absolutely,
yeah.
It's tricky. Did you have any more, Denny, or was it? Are we?
I have just a few slides. Yeah, if you don't mind, let me just wrap up. Sam, I think that was really helpful. I appreciate it. Don't worry about the part where it isn't working. The main points there are the process, which is that you're going to be upgrading and downgrading services and components, and he gave us an approach for how to think about how to go about that work so we can plan our own projects. So I find it really helpful. So really just want to wrap up with some of the lessons that I learned. Oh, let me go ahead and share my desktop here. Can you guys see the slide?
Yes.
Okay, great. So some of the lessons I learned when using ngUpgrade, and I've just used it a little bit, right? So I'm at the beginner stage. Well, I learned, number one, it does allow for that kind of self-paced upgrade plan, which is really helpful, especially if you're like me, you're learning Angular along with AngularJS, but you want to get your project moved forward as quickly as possible. The Angular docs, especially at that link shown there, there's a nice write-up on how to use it. And some of the complexities that Sam mentioned are at least referenced there as well. So they might not give you the nice rich example that Sam showed you, but the concept is there, and they'll kind of introduce it to you there, even within that document. So check that out if you're looking at ngUpgrade. When strange things occur, look for an example like that QuickStart project. I've heard about the possibility of style collisions when you're using ngUpgrade. I haven't experienced that personally, but just be aware that there might be some naming collisions if you're trying to maybe use like Angular material within your Angular project and upgrade that, they may not be compatible. So I'm not certain on that, but just be aware there's a possibility there, there's a conflict there if you're using ngUpgrade and iterating through that upgrade process. And then also I learned it's worthwhile to set up a TypeScript build for your project even before you start bringing Angular into it. I did not believe that was the case before I tried to use ngUpgrade. And you're going to experience some frustration during the build setup if something other than the example that's already out there is shown. And in general, this is a great library. This ngUpgrade library is a great tool that allows us to perform our upgrade on our existing AngularJS code base. It's pretty easy to set up and get going, and then from there, it's fun to kind of learn about the upgrading, downgrading process as you address it, component by component, service by service. So what's next for our series? Now that we've been through this ngUpgrade and we've seen how to run both Angular and AngularJS at the same time, it's really just our final session next week. And that's going to be a session where we take some time to walk through some examples, some things that may or may not have used ngUpgrade, but just example migrations from AngularJS to Angular. So stay tuned to NG Houston and meet us back here at next week. That's it, Bonnie.
That was awesome. Thank you, guys. And we will see you. And next week we have David, right?
That's right. David Owen is going to be with us. He's going to be featuring his NG Rosetta project, which is a public GitHub repository available right now. So we'll walk through that and show you how you get some real value out of using that.
That's awesome. Thank you, Denny. Thank you, Sam.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Guys. See y'all next week.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.